giving out subsidies and economic development incentives for business. I understand that you've been somewhat of a critic on that practice. What's your take on the governor's economic development strategy as she's developed it?
Well, there are several stance on corporate welfare of government picking winners and losers. Government doesn't do a good job of picking winners and losers, but also at the same time, other states use incentives to attract business to come, and so you can't fight the battle with one hand tied behind your back. So the question then becomes, how do you make the most effective use of incentives? And that's where I have a difference with how the Commerce RI operates. Through Build Rhode Island tax credits and other tax credits, they're giving a lot of credits for real estate and their hotels, office buildings, mixed-use facilities. And when we looked at it, we felt we were over-investing in real estate and under-investing in innovation. Now, time will tell if that's the case, but I think there are some real questions about whether we're making the most effective long-term use of the public monies that are being invested. And only time will tell, but I believe in markets. So if there's a market for a hotel, people will build hotels and make money. If you need to build a hotel to incentivize a development, that's a one-off. You have to look at that. But we seem to have gone very deep into real estate.
Sure. Do you think it's fair, for instance, if you offer a hotel a subsidy to build or erect the hotel? Do you think it's fair to the hotel next door, who may not have gotten a generous subsidy when they build their structure?
Well, if the hotel that gets the subsidy is able to have more competitive prices, the answer is no.
Sure. It seems to have an unintended negative effect on the market.
Well, it's complicated. You have to have a strategy. You have to look at your overall development plan. You have to ask the question, for the kind of development and investment we want in the state, do we need hotels? Where do we need the hotels? How many hotels? Once we subsidize and build the hotels, what's the likely market? And one of the things that I've never understood, if there was a market and there was going to be a return on investment, people would invest money. So they feel they need a push, they need some public money in order to have that enterprise thrive.
Sure. One of the highlights of the National Governors Association meeting obviously was the mega CEO, one of the superstar CEOs, Elon Musk, as we're talking about, the CEO of Tesla. He took a shot at the press, and he said that the press is too focused on the costs of economic development incentives and subsidies, and not often missing the big picture. But in my opinion, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way, considering that Mr. Musk, my research, up until 2015, his company had been the recipient of $5 billion in government subsidies. Now, to be fair, Mr. Musk would point out that he believes he's building technologies that once they're developed, they will be extremely beneficial because they will cut down on our dependence on foreign natural resources like oil, fossil fuels, and they will protect the environment. So on a bunch of levels, he thinks it makes sense for the government to do that. And furthermore, he would also argue that we've given more subsidies to big oil companies, which is not a good thing either. But did it rub you the wrong way that someone like him, who's been such a recipient of massive government help, would criticize the press for pointing it out and pointing out the costs?
No, of course it would. Now, we've had a long history in this country, going back to the beginning, founding of the Republic, for government and industry to work together on technology. The building of the Erie Canal in the early 1800s was a new technology for its time. Sure. We do a lot to support university research, which is really very important, and that oftentimes is in partnership with private business. So government has a role to play in supporting basic research and in supporting the development of technology, which we've done, whether through public works or with our universities. But at the same time, it has to be transparent. Those are not Mr. Musk's dollars; those are public dollars, and they have every right to know where it goes.
Absolutely.
And a great case was Solyndra, was the name of the company that
Stimulus, right?
Yeah, stimulus money. They're going to build all this energy, renewable energy kinds of facilities. I don't think they ever built anything. It went under. It was our money, and it helps inform public decisions. So there is never any excuse for a lack of transparency in the conducting of public business, but there is a role for government to play to work with universities and with business in developing technology and science. You can't expect industry alone to do it unless there's the infrastructure to help them along.
It does seem like you need to strike a rather delicate balance.
So there's a balance. You want to be careful that you don't pick winners and losers. You want to be careful that, particularly at the state level, that you do it strategically, so you're investing in technology that has some kind of potential return in your
Sure.
state, not in California, which is oftentimes the case. But it's in that, and we can debate what are the specifics on that issue, but investing in education, science, technology always pays off, but never in the dark. It always has to have sunshine.
Sure. I think that's obviously the key is transparency. I think it engenders confidence in the public when they see what is being done.
Right,
It's
and
their money.
every investment's not going to pan out. There's nothing wrong. It's like baseball. You're not going to hit a home run every time you're up, but you ought to know, the public ought to know when their investment is paying off and when
Sure.
it's not, so you don't repeat the same mistake.
So you will always have the Solyndras of the world, but hopefully you'll have some home runs in there.
Well, it's not supporting a specific company. It's supporting the technology
Okay.
that different companies can use. So, for example, with the electronic car, if we ventured, if Musk or Volvo now, which is now going to produce an all-electric fleet of cars in 2019, came to the university here, or Brown or U or I or whatever, and said, we want to work with you in developing extended batteries. Well, that's the kind of technology that we should work with the company on. That has tremendous synergies for academic institutions, and it has potential synergies for the innovation economy to bring jobs to the state. That's fine. But doing what Obama did with Solyndra, say we're going to pick XYZ company who happened to make significant contributions politically, and we're going to
Wow, what a surprise.
and they're going to be the winner. Usually doesn't pan out, and you have to be very careful that you don't develop a political system that's just based on the ability to pay to play.
Sure.
That's a concern.
And those political decisions are always made with a very short-term mindset. In other words, I was recently reading one of your op-eds that ran some various publications more recently, and as you pointed out, it's very hard to judge a governor's economic development strategy as a success or a failure based on the relatively short time that it takes place while that person's in office. And you were talking about Governor Raimondo,
Yeah.
and you had mentioned that she took office in 2015, and to really assess the effectiveness of her strategy, you can't just say on 2015 what were the numbers and on May of 2017 what are the numbers, because when she took office, it took her a good 6 months to get the legislature to do anything that she asked. Then it took time to implement it. So could you speak to that for a second?
Sure. Well, there is no academic research, and this is not a political commentary, that points to a clear conclusion that a specific governor's action, results in jobs. There are a lot of factors. You can be governor of a state that's mineral rich, and if the mineral market declines, you're lost.
Sure.
So you're affected by the environment, you're affected by the natural resources of
The
your state,
market.
market by a lot of things. And so when governors come into office and say, well, I got credit for creating 5,000 jobs, and then the economy goes bad and they lose 5,000 jobs, it's not their fault the economy went bad for losing 5,000, just as you can't show a cause-effect relationship. So what that tells you is a couple of things. First thing it tells you is that you need to think about what the state can do to create a friendly business climate. And we know what the state can do to create a friendly business climate. Good schools, competitive taxes, limited regulation, good infrastructure. So those are investments that taxpayers and business can make to attract business to come to the state. That's very different from picking winners and losers.
Sure. It does seem that your point is a classic economic problem or an economic fallacy of confusing correlation with causation.
Yeah.
Just because you happen to be governor of a state that was mineral rich and the price of the minerals went up, and therefore your economy boomed, doesn't necessarily mean it was your economic policies or your legislation that made that. In fact, it didn't.
Well, a good example is if you were governor of North Dakota, And one day your economy is kind of just a rural agricultural economy, and the next day somebody discovers fracking, and you're fracking half North Dakota. Now you're an economic genius.
And that did happen.
Well, that's good. That's why I'm using that.
Sure.
That example exactly. But you also have to know how to take advantage of it. You can have the good fortune of something outside of your state happening to your advantage, but then you have to have in place the political leadership that should leverage that and maximize that.
Sure. Another interesting thing that you pointed out in that article that I'm referencing is the fact that the much developed in 1959. And it didn't create even 10,000 jobs until at least 20 years later. Today there are about 50,000 jobs there. So just to, not to belabor the point, but just to point out that the governor at the time, whoever he was or she was, people might have looked at the research triangle and said this wasn't a great idea because they didn't have all the job creation. But fast forward, as the decades go by, it's been a smashing success.
Well, and that's why when you elect a governor, you have to look that person right square in the eye and say, what's your vision? What's your strategy? So if a governor has leadership, vision, and strategy, he or she can begin to implement a program that will pay back. But to stand up 3 years later and say, we declare victory, never happens that way.
Right. It does seem that, unfortunately, that the system of government we have, or the democracy that we have, it encourages governors and legislators to think short term, when thinking long term would be more beneficial for us.
Well, but yeah, and that's where the leadership comes in, because when a person runs for office or if a person's running for office, you try to indicate that you're more capable than the incumbent in producing for the people in that office. So you have to talk about what actually has been happening. On the other hand, if you're an incumbent running for office, you have to point out accomplishments, so you'll get snowed under in a political campaign. But you need to do that with a grain of salt. And the example, the best example is Governor Raimondo came into office in January 15. She introduced an aggressive economic development program, really geared largely to corporate welfare. But that program wasn't enacted by the legislature 6 months later.
Sure.
But yet, because of the national economy, we started coming out of the recession in 2009, and there's been steady growth in the economy, since then. So the cause effect is hard to understand sometimes.
And I think that applies to former Governor Chafee as well. I think that if he is going to run for governor again, I think he's going to point to his 4 years in office and the steady increase in employment and the steady decrease in the unemployment rate, and he's going to say, look, I did it before.
He had a very laissez-faire program compared to this governor's program. The other
Sure.
hand, Don Carcieri is an interesting case. He ran for office, and on the pledge of creating, I said, my memory serves me, 20,000 jobs.
Yep.
He was well on his way to creating 20,000 jobs when the Great Recession hit.
Right.
And we lost a lot more. We lost 40,000 jobs through that period. Well, the governor didn't get smarter or dumber, as a result of that. So you have to recognize what happens in the national economy,
of course,
the world economy, and how those events translate.
The whole notion of long-term and short-term thinking, it reminds me of the whole pension reform debate, because there were several Democrat legislators who voted for pension reform, and they paid the ultimate price. They got unelected. Some of the unions organized in their districts and beat them in primaries. But it seems like in the long term, I think that those legislators made decisions that were beneficial for the state obviously going forward, but they paid the price. So.
Well, this is a more fundamental problem you're describing. Right now, politics becomes a career. And so you get into politics when you're in your 20s and you get one office and you want to stay in. And how do you achieve the delicate balance of doing what your constituency sends you to there, versus the responsibility of doing what's going to help in the long run? The debate we're having on Obamacare in the Congress right now, the debate on any number of things, politicians are more concerned about their reelection, which is certainly understandable,
Sure.
than doing what is in the long-term benefit. I happen to be Pollyannaish enough to believe that if you promise something, you stick to your knitting, you carry it through, even though it may not be popular, you have a better chance of succeeding than just pandering.
Right. I like to think that I've been as hard on some of the politicians in the state as anybody, but when you have a conversation like this and you think about it, you almost have to feel sorry for them in some respects, because it's not an easy, it's a very delicate balance to have to try and strike.
It is, and
Sure.
but that's what leadership's about.
Sure. Gary, you've been you've been in Rhode Island for decades, and you were at RIPAC for how many years?
Close to 30.
30, and then you were Governor Kachiri's chief of staff for a couple of years.
Not chief of administration.
Director of administration for a couple of years?
Yeah, a few years, and then
Sure.
director of revenue as well.
Director of Revenue, and since then, you've obviously kept a close eye for the last decade on Rhode Island politics and the economy. What are some things that you think that, if we could just kind of wave a magic wand, or if we could do without the messy sausage making that takes place in the legislature, what could we do to improve the Rhode Island economy if we could have our way right here?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't do away with the messy sausage making, because no one of us is as smart as all of us. And so in a democracy, people with different points of view are going to have different ideas on how to reach the promised land.
I'm elevating you above them. I'm telling you to make the call.
No, I'm not. So they can have different ideas of how to reach the promised land, and no one has a monopoly on the truth.
So you like the system, all right?
I like the system to be a lot more open than it is, a lot
Sure.
more transparent, a lot more driven by fact and information than
emotion, sure.
than personality and other things. But I don't dismiss the system out of hand, because it's not perfect. But
I didn't mean to imply that I would do that. I'm sorry.
Travel to Russia and tell me what you think of the system. It comes back down to two things for me. One is education. We've had, and this is not just true of Rhode Island, but it's true of a number of places. We've had generation after generation of kids going to the same failing schools, and we wonder why we don't have a more skilled, better trained, workforce. And so if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to really reform education and have education for the kids' benefit, not for the adults' benefit. A lot of our education policy is driven by what's good for the teacher unions and
Does it ever seem that way?
yeah. So
Wow.
that takes political courage, because the way our political system operates, some of the public sector unions, as you know,
Boy, they are strong.
They're strong, and they work hard. They do a good job representing.
Do they ever?
Their members. They're politically, very important in the campaign in terms of
Are they ever?
funds
Sure.
and elbow grease,
Manpower.
manpower. And so I think somehow our system has to, and I don't mean to pick on labor. I could pick on some businesses that have also received the golden calf. So somehow to minimize the interest of special interest in key areas, and the primary one is education. The second is getting more bang for the buck. Government can be much more efficient than it is, and it's very hard to get there, because if you can make government more efficient, have more bang for the buck, then you could use the public dollars to reinvest.
To do more.
Yes.
Do more with more. Sure. Well, great. And one quick question for you before I let you go. Do you think it seems like that House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello and Senate President Dominic Ruggiero seem to be cooling off a bit? Seems like they're going to
Meet tomorrow.
meet tomorrow. Who knows if that'll lead to a return of either the House or Senate to resolve this budget that's out there in limbo. Do you think that a resolution of this problem, one way or the other, will impact the economy in a significant way?
Well, it depends on how long it goes. If they, resolve the impact in the next couple of months, next few weeks, it won't have much of an impact. What it's doing right now is causing tremendous inconvenience to municipalities and how to get out the property tax bills. It's creating tremendous uncertainty in what revenues will be available to fund the programs that are agreed to fund. For example, we increased the cigarette tax. Well, if that tax is not enacted for 3 months, then we lose a quarter of that revenue. So it'll wipe out some of the uncertainty. It'll make things much more responsible in terms of how we deal with intergovernmental fiscal things, cities and towns. And then the final thing, the quicker we resolve it, the less of a black eye we have. It's not so much that we have differences over policy. This is a straight-out political power struggle. The Speaker needs to maintain the integrity of the budget process. And so if those things can be resolved in the next short time, it'll be more an embarrassment than a problem. If it goes on, into the fall and beyond the fall, then it becomes very problematic.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much for the conversation, and thank you for appearing here with me today.
My pleasure.
Great to talk to you.
Good to see you again.
All right.